Ahead of this big double opening, we're diving into the biggest movie event of the year. It is the Barbenheimer craze.
Boy, Barbenheimer, that weird cinematic pairing, has movie fans making it a double feature this weekend. 21 Alive's John Wagner is one of them. And ahead of this weekend, he wanted to find an Indiana connection to one of these wildly different films. Now, Barbie doesn't have a whole lot of Hoosier roots. But as John tells us, there's a character you won't see anywhere in the Oppenheimer movie, an Indiana woman who blazed a trail for women in science.
We're in a race against the Nazis. And I know what it means. If the Nazis have a bomb. This is a matter of life and death. I can perform this miracle.
World War II would be over. Our boys would come home.
All right, that's a pretty good tease, and I know I'm a news producer. I write them all the time. It's also the preview for one of the most anticipated movies of the summer, Oppenheimer, and I'm one of the anticipators. I love historical biopics, and it was shot on glorious 70mm motion picture film, which is huge for analog nerds like me. When I went looking for an Indiana connection to Oppenheimer, I found one, but it turns out you won't see it on celluloid this weekend. What I did find was the life and the legacy of legendary physicist Dr. Melba Phillips from Pike County, Indiana. And as it turns out, if you want to learn about Melba Phillips, the person you should ask is, at least at one time, the front woman for fabled Indiana goth punk band We Are Hex. I'm talking about Jill Weiss Simmons. She also happens to be an accomplished historian. That aside, let's get back to Melba Phillips. Who is she?
Melba Phillips was a leading physicist in the heroic age of physics in the 30s, when it seemed like a new discovery was being made about every other day.
Just think about that statement for a second. The 20s and 30s weren't really an easy time for anybody, and that includes women, especially women trying to carve out a place in the sciences.
She ended up going to the University of California, Berkeley, and getting there just the year after the famous Robert Oppenheimer started there as a teacher in theoretical physics. And Melba quickly went from being a grad student to a trusted colleague and then a collaborator with Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer and Phillips shared something really important at the core when it came to physics and science. It was a desire to solve the unknown, not really to pore over and retest theories that had been proven time and time again. But Phillips had two strengths that Oppenheimer was, as we've kind of learned, sort of lousy at, namely handwriting.
When he was teaching for his bad handwriting, he would be writing on the board in front of his classroom, facing the students, and then he would keep writing, get to the end, and then just start back at the beginning without erasing.
And when it came to critical calculations that would prove those big ideas,
Melba, as he called her, Melba is working out the math. So yes, I think he really relied on her there for several years.
Their working relationship would culminate in something groundbreaking and foundational in the world of physics. It's called the Phillips-Oppenheimer process. So what is it?
I think that if I, as a historian, try to explain this physics process, what you'll get is angry letters from physics people that actually get it.
Okay, yeah, Jill is right, and I'm in the same boat. So with the disclaimer that I don't have a physics degree, in the simplest terms, the Phillips-Oppenheimer process is a type of deuteron-induced nuclear reaction which requires less energy to achieve fusion. Okay, so suffice to say, it's a big deal for people a lot smarter than me. But even with the validation of now having a PhD and having her name attached to Oppenheimer in this newly published pillar of physics, she's still a woman in the 30s, and the world just hasn't gotten any kinder.
Her first appearance in the newspaper is really embarrassing and paints her in an unfair, unflattering light.
The short version is Oppenheimer often hung out with his students and colleagues, we know that, and one night Oppenheimer and Dr. Phillips go out for a ride and the papers run away with it.
Poor, pretty Miss Melba, the great Dr. Oppenheimer's assistant, was in a parked car, which has a connotation at that time, even more than today. The implication being, of course, that they were having a sexual relationship, and I think this probably was pretty embarrassing for her, that her first appearance on the public stage wasn't for her accomplishments, but this sort of insinuation and this infantilizing, sexualizing of her, as opposed to being treated like a respected scientist.
When the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, as you'll see in the Oppenheimer movie, the U.S. government responds by weaponizing the scientific community in new and terrifying ways. The Manhattan Project scientists, including Oppenheimer, detonate the first bomb in New Mexico in July of 1945. Just a few weeks later, 250,000 Japanese men, women, and children were annihilated in two blinding, violent waves of nuclear energy. The scientists who had developed that technology, and really the world, mournfully stepped back and looked at what had been done.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Dr. Phillips is one of many that stand up at this time and say this is not what their work was for. Oppenheimer himself tells the president he feels he has blood on his hands. There's a big pushback against atomic energy at this time, and Eisenhower himself would send Dr. Phillips a letter thanking her for her efforts to prevent a future nuclear war. But there was just one tiny little sexist problem.
Unfortunately, this letter from the president is addressed to Mr. Phillips, which seems sort of par for the course at this point.
And the road gets rougher as we get into the 1950s. During the Red Scare, Dr. Phillips refused to make any kind of pledge to the federal government. Now, some might call that patriotic dissent. The United States government's anti-American Senate subcommittee, however, well, they called her a communist. But like a true Hoosier, she stood firm. Consequently, she lost teaching jobs. But even in hard times, she never gave up on the scientific spirit. She took years of unemployment on the chin and later climbed back up the academic ladder, ending up as a hugely respected professor at the University of Chicago, in New York, Beijing. As the years keep coming, so do the apologies from schools she'd been fired from. She even has awards named in her honor. Dr. Phillips would later find herself back home again in Indiana, spending her final years not far from where she was born. Melba died a few years back, but this Hoosier, this woman, she dedicated her life to becoming Dr. Phillips and to cut new paths through the fields of physics and science for anyone that dared to follow them.
She would want young women to be elbows out in the laboratory, making space for themselves, trusting in their abilities to lead the way and to innovate, and not to let anybody get in their way. And I think that she would want young women to bring others with them as they rise. I think all of that can be traced back to her Hoosier roots.
I'll be seeing Oppenheimer with my wife, but I wish we could take Melba Phillips so she could pick out all the little Hollywood inaccuracies in the lab scenes. Standing in line for popcorn, John Wagner, 21 Alive News.